So I've taken this photo here of a castle in Italy. It was a photograph given to me by a friend from a holiday snap. And I'm looking at the simple design, a sort of A shape, and then the foreground here. And how I can sort of make up and break down my tonal values in the bigger shapes. So I'd normally sort of start with a thumbnail sketch. And I'll just get my camera to focus here. And I've speeded up this video so perhaps it'll make more sense. So I'm looking at the top of the main part of the castle and just outlining its main shape. And just dotting in a couple of those recesses in the wall that I think at one time were probably used for shooting arrows from. Under times of siege and conflict. You wonder what the history of this castle is, and sort of gets your imagination going a bit. So I'm looking at those dark trees in the front and really want to keep my shapes down to the basic ones only. So I'm looking at this dark horizontal pattern made by the conifer trees that you can see me sketching in here. There's a little wall about here according to the photograph, and I'm not sure how much I want to stick to the photograph, but I'm just choosing to include most of the information from the photograph, and then when I actually come to paint it, I'll decide how much of those details I want to keep and use. I like working that way. Either that or you do a really simple sketch. But I like to put in a fair bit of information, because then it becomes, you create options as to what will work when you're painting and what won't work. But I'm looking at how these conifers work against the blue sky background. The foreground is pretty basic. It's quite complex if you look at the photo. But of course, if you make every area of the painting too busy, then you can get into some serious problems, and by the end of it, the painting will look like it's a bit too busy. Nowhere to rest the eye. The obvious place to keep simple and flat, of course, would be the sky, if you look at the photo. So I just got the paint started here. I'm using cerulean blue, ultramarine blue, Naples yellow, raw sienna and burnt sienna, and a little bit of indigo on the far right. For a full description, for lessons by where you will get the full instruction that includes a support pack and the opportunity to offer your painting for a critique, you can buy these lessons from my website, howardjonesart.co.uk, and if you pop along there, you'll find a list of different painting tutorials. They're usually about between 40 minutes and an hour, perhaps a little bit more in length, the videos, and as I say, supported with packs that'll give you all the colours that are used, the brushes, etc., tips and advice that support the actual video when you're watching it. So it's a very reasonable price if you pop over to there and have a look. So this is a speeded up exercise that I hope you'll find useful. Just putting in the sky here, that's a bit of ultramarine blue and a bit of cerulean blue, and the Naples yellow I've used in the lower part of the sky and over the castle walls. So I often work with a plate because I highly recommend, if you're just starting out in watercolour, or perhaps you're in that place where you've never really sat down and created a palette, a reliable palette, then take a look at one of my other videos. I'll put the link in the description below to that specific video, where I show how I use a regular palette, and the importance of using a regular palette. But as I say, here I'm using a plate because once you've got used to using regular colours and you've learned a bit of colour theory, what I like to do is I like to place colours. I sort of couple up colours. I'll pair up colours, ultramarine blue with burnt sienna. I sometimes use light red with cerulean blue, viridian green with alizarin crimson. So I like pairing up colours, and I find it best to use a palette for this away from my normal closed lid palette. So I'm just throwing in some texture into the sky, creating fairly neutral sort of colours for the moment. There is a bit of that burnt sienna in the foreground that you can see, but I use my delivery and distribution technique a lot in this, and that is simply picking up a colour, placing it onto the painting, cleaning the brush, taking most of the water and paint out, and then distributing that paint around. And again, as I say, I describe this technique more fully in other tutorials, but I'm hoping you're getting the gist of the technique here by watching this. So working wet on damp, so my edges will be quite soft still, and the colour you see me use here is a mixture of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, sometimes a little bit of raw sienna. And that greeny effect does come from cerulean blue and raw sienna. So I'm really thinking to establish this band of dark trees and foliage in the upper foreground. As the paper dries out, the more it dries out, the more attention I give to the upper shapes. Those are the top edges of the trees, the castle, as it sits against the sky. Those shapes, when those shapes sit against the sky, what I'm doing, of course, is I'm playing light off against dark and creating clear shapes, defined edges, hard edges. And here I've picked up the ultramarine blue, as I thought the sky needed jollying up. So I always get to that point where I like to create my neutrals and my tones, and then before it gets a chance to dry completely, what I'll do is I'll put in some more saturated colours. And saturated colours simply mean colours that sort of come straight out of the tube, colours that you haven't modified by adding other colours to them or water to them. They create a brightness which is required just to sort of lift certain areas of the painting. Just using kitchen paper here, like a standard tissue paper, lifting out some light areas, suggesting shadows in the sky. I'll use it sometimes for lifting out textures as well in walls and in foregrounds. Just dropping the brush down in places where I feel as I need to soften an edge. I'm picking up, I've added a little bit of phthalo green to my palette. You can just see on the edge of the screen. And that lovely dark green mixed with some burnt sienna will give you these rich dark greens that you can see appearing now. Those being the tops of my conifer trees. And all the time the paper is drying out, those shapes that I'm creating, they retain their edge better. And throughout the surface you'll find areas that dry out quicker than others. And I'm just scraping out the little bit of wall that pops through. If you look at the photograph, if you want to run it back and just look at the photograph, you'll see that there's a little bit of wall there. So working even darker now. I do have a free downloadable ebook on my website. If you pop along to howardjonesart.co.uk, and on the tuition page off the menu, you'll find a free 22-page book to download. It's like a top 10 tips, if you like, entitled Watercolour Turn Me Loose. So into the lower foreground, I'm just adding now some further shapes to suggest the rough ground. Very rich mix of burnt sienna going on here. That's another delivery and then distribution. So you'll see me put the clean colour directly onto the paper. Then what I do is I clean the brush and I leave some water in the brush on this in this case, and manipulate and distribute that lovely colour around as I see fit to create the textures. The sort of textures that infer that type of terrain. In other words, it's sort of rough, broken ground, very dry, typical of these Mediterranean scenes, fields, areas. If you're enjoying my videos and you'd like to know as and when they're uploaded each time, please subscribe. And if you hit the bell icon at the bottom of the screen, what you'll do is you'll get immediate notifications as and when I upload new videos. Better still, if you could share, there's a little button down there for sharing my videos. You can send these on to friends and colleagues. Perhaps you might have friends in your art societies, and just pop along and click on the share button. That would be fantastic. So the green that you see me put in here is a lot of the phthalo green with some lemon yellow that I've picked up, and it may look really garish and too bright at this stage, which is very intentional. What I like to do is I like to start off with bright colours and then mute them, then knock them back, because I find that that's the best way to keep your colours clean. There is another way of working by where you can just put all your greys and neutrals in and then put saturated colours on top. I just prefer to work this way. I do work the other way sometimes. Depends on what I'm painting. So just darkening all the time, just making sure that these areas are dark enough. And by the time the painting's finished, those really bright green foreground colours will look a lot less garish. This is very much a wet in wet painting, so I'm trying to catch the areas at an appropriate stage for where I can keep putting paint on top of wet paint. The sort of window of opportunity. So there's my little wall. I might have to scrape that back out. If you're wondering how to detect whether the paper is still wet, I mean it's fairly obvious. If you lean forward onto to the side of your painting and look across the surface of the paper, you'll see where it's shiny, and where it's shiny it's still obviously very wet, and you need really to be practicing those things as to how to load the brush appropriately for each stage of the drying timing, the drying process. Sometimes it's better to apply a fully loaded brush to a really damp area. Other occasions you'll find it better to a partially loaded brush working on just damp paper can have quite a different effect. It's picking up a little bit of that original Naples yellow here and dropping it into wet areas. Sort of brings a bit of light, a sort of bounced light off the surfaces. So this little sort of rundown here on the left hand side from my trees looks like a vertical caterpillar. So all I need to do, rather than panic and try to remove it, I'm just taking the brush and moving the paint around so that it becomes part of the foreground. And that too will knock the colour out of that foreground quite a bit. So it's time to tackle the actual castle, the shape of the castle. And I'm starting with a cool colour here. It's a mix of ultramarine blue and raw sienna. And I'm picking on the angles that are away from the sun. So that's why I've chosen that colour, sort of cooler colour. And then I'm just dropping in a little bit of wet burnt sienna while it's still all wet, just to warm it up a little bit. Once again, if I feel as though I'm losing any edges, I just scrape them back with my palette knife. Just popping in a little bit of darker recesses, the sort of shapes that perhaps in the foreground there will be away from the light. You can just see I'm creating textures more than anything else, texture and tone, making absolutely sure the tonal value jumps from the immediate foreground, which is quite light and sunny, into these darker, sort of dark green shadowy tree areas. And now this is the left hand side of the castle wall, which is in direct sunlight. So you can see that I've placed those windows. I call them windows. They are those recesses that I should imagine they'd be firing their arrows from if the castle was under siege, under attack. And I'm just spattering a little bit of white off the brush to create texture. Again, a little bit of the palette knife just to clean up some edges and pull out some shapes in the still wet paint. And as those little window recesses go in, you can see how the wall becomes suddenly more visible. And I've just scraped out a couple of telegraph posts, which probably weren't there when the castle was built. So I've scraped out the vertical posts, and then scraped out a couple of cables, a couple of wires connecting them. That could be done, the wires particularly could be done, of course, with a white pencil or a white pastel pencil. I quite like scraping them out like this. They could also be done with a rigger brush and white gouache. Thought I'd put a little flag on the top of the castle wall there, just to bring extra attention to the view. To direct the viewer to that particular spot. And then I speed dry it just so that I can get the finishing touches done. And in a moment we'll put the mount around it to see what it looks like. But overall it's okay. Quite happy with the tonal design of it all. Little bit of white gouache here on the rigger brush. I take it straight from the tube. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, folks, and do remember to subscribe and hit the bell icon if you require immediate notification as and when I upload each new video, and hit the share button if you'd be really so good and pass them on to friends and colleagues. And in the meantime, happy painting.